Dixie. The American South is a distinct and colorful part of the United States. It has its own history. Customs. Culture. Music. And overlaying everything is its distinctive and charming Southern drawl. A sound as easy on the ears as moonlight on water.
So we've got the African American culture. We've got that early Tidewater culture. We had the Ulster Scots culture, and then we had the Virginia Germans. And so those four diverse groups settled into this region from the 18th century.
The American South is rhododendron blossoms. Cypress swamps. Alligators. Spanish moss. Impenetrable forested hills. And glorious mountain ranges. On one hand, Dixie's home to historic plantations. NASCAR. Modern cities. And a new industrial land of promise. On the other, Dixie is the home of the Confederacy. Slavery. Mysterious, haunting places. Shadows containing dark secrets. and its own brand of organized crime. But it is also home to the finest whiskey and bourbon in the country.
Whiskey is a broad category, and which some moonshines could fall into that category, and that is distilled from grain and then stored in wood. That's pretty much whiskey. Bourbon then takes that and becomes more specific. Has to be 51% corn, stored in a new charred oak barrel. Has to come off the still below 160 proof and go into the barrel below 124 proof.
In this program, we will travel to the Appalachians of the Deep South and find out how Dixie became the moonshine and bourbon capital of the world.
There were people who brought with them stills and copper to make whiskey apparatuses from the very beginning of their settlement. And so whiskey became a backwoods form of currency and an expected drink when visitors would arrive for many households.
Peruse through the shelves of any liquor store in the country, and you'll see America's finest. The legendary bourbons and whiskeys from the South. Jack Daniels, Knob Creek, Maker's Mark, Old Crow, Buffalo Trace, Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, and many more small batch moonshines distilled in the hills and hollows of Appalachia. These famous whiskey and bourbon brand names have a long tradition and history behind them. A tradition that dates back to when Daniel Boone took the wilderness trail across the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky. Roddy Moore is the curator of the Blue Ridge Institute and Museum.
Everybody knows someone that has made liquor. And usually it's somebody within the family, but not that close, because they want the folklore saying, well, my grandfather made whiskey. But it was made for a local community and used for that.
Those early pioneers brought with them the skills and knowledge of distilling to the mountains. Steeped in their own shadowy stamp of mystique, their story is an original American story of communal survival, ingenuity, brilliant entrepreneurship, and a distrust of the government. To understand this American story, we'll have to go back far into history. It starts when the first humans drank what some ancients called the water of life, alcohol. While no one knows when the first alcohol beverage was brewed and consumed, it was presumably the result of a fortuitous accident, when some lucky guy tasted the liquid that resulted from some rotting fruit and got the first buzz in history. The production of alcohol occurs through a natural process called fermentation. It begins with yeast, a single-celled life form, a fungus in fact, found almost everywhere. And it loves to eat carbohydrates, sugars and starch. When yeast does its thing, eating sugar, two byproducts result. One is alcohol. The other is carbon dioxide. You know fermentation is occurring when you see the escaping CO2 bubbles. The big question is, when did humans start intentionally producing alcoholic beverages? Undoubtedly, the builders of Stonehenge were drinking a beer-like brew dating back to the early Neolithic period, 12,000 years ago. Wine clearly appeared as a finished product in Egyptian pictographs around 4000 BC. Indeed, for the Egyptians, beer and wine were associated with the gods. The ancient Greeks were notorious for their consumption of wine. At the same time, they developed a taste for mead, a product of fermenting honey. Dating back to 1000 BC, the Chinese considered alcohol to be a spiritual food. Basically, because of its state and mind-altering capabilities, alcohol has held a special place in all cultures around the world since the beginning of agriculture. There is beer, the result of fermenting grains. Wine, the result of fermenting fruits. And mead, the result of fermenting honey. However, natural fermentation has some limitations. Eventually, so much alcohol is produced that it kills the yeast and the fermentation stops. Whether the brew be wine or beer, this occurs when the alcohol content reaches roughly around 10% to 15%. In modern times, brewers and winemakers have discovered yeast that allow them to produce very specific alcohol contents ranging from 5 to 20%. The other limitation of natural fermentation is when the brew is done fermenting. You mostly have the base source, such as grape juice in the case of wine. Humans, being ever ingenious, asked the question, can we get a brew with a higher alcohol content and greater purity? And indeed, it became possible. The process was called distillation, and the result was called spirits. The earliest evidence of true distillation of alcohol comes from 12th century alchemists located in southern Italy. Around the same time, Irish whiskey and German brandy made their appearance. And there is evidence that the Chinese were close behind in discovering a means of distilling alcohol. By 1494, distilled spirits were widespread throughout northern Europe. 100 years later, books were published about distillation, and recipes for grain spirits were passed down from generation to generation, especially in Scotland. By the 17th century, commercial distilling in industrial stills became common. Except for the invention of the continuous still in the 19th century, the basic process of distillation has not changed since those early days, when spirits were first ushered into the world. It is this knowledge and expertise of distillation that the settlers of Appalachia brought with them to their new homes in the New World. That knowledge of distillation might have come to naught except for one fortuitous discovery. A grain cultivated by Native Americans for 3,000 years, corn. Once in America, these early pioneers molded their distilling ways to fit this new crop. It was a crop they could grow on small plots of land they homesteaded. Corn became the predominant ingredient in their whiskey, and in particular, bourbon. Charlie Thompson grew up in one of those Appalachian whiskey distilling communities. Now he is a professor at Duke University and has written the definitive book on the people who settled this part of the country and their connection to the manufacture of spirits, known locally as moonshine. He knows that the journey his people took from the old world was a long one. It started 400 years ago.
We have to go back to Scotland to really understand who these people were. They're often referred to as the Scots-Irish. The Scots lived on plantations in Ireland. They were they were Protestants, first of all, somewhat like the Presbyterians we know today, but they were moved into Ireland on plantations with the promise of land ownership. These Scots were supposedly more conservative in their behavior and so forth. They moved into land owned by large landowners. So they were disappointed, for one thing, that they weren't able to own land. And they also intermarried with the Irish. The Irish supposedly were the ones who invented whiskey. These were already farmers. They were already people seeking a way to be independent. But Ireland represented a huge disappointment for them. And as we know, land was scarce, the growing season is short. We ended up with the potato famine. But these people who came to the Appalachians were, by and large, prior to the potato famine. They arrived looking for land. There were advertisements that went out to people in Ireland, to the Scots in particular, Northern Ireland, Scots-Irish, and saying there's land available in America. And so people pawned everything they had, sold themselves into indentured servitude, and came to this country. And they got here and they still had to work, and they still weren't landowners. But at their earliest opportunity, when they had worked off their indenture, they began migrating, looking for land.
Once in America, the Scotch-Irish formed a more or less cohesive unit. It has been said they were a people who nurtured a proud and sometimes argumentative spirit, as well as a healthy disdain for authority. They tended to settle in large kinship groups and often shared the same surname. Surnames such as Allison, Irwin, McLaughlin, McClanahan, MacDonald, McDowell, McCrae, Alexander, Chambers, and Davison. Always looking for land and freedom, the Scotch-Irish arrived at an inopportune time in America. When they immigrated in the 18th century, the best agricultural land had long been bought and cultivated right up to the Appalachian Mountains. The free and cheap land for the Scotch-Irish was in what was America's new frontier. A frontier centered in the heart of the southern Appalachian Mountains. Coming from the lowlands of the plantation of Ulster in present-day Northern Ireland, they were not mountain people, so they needed to start afresh in order to survive.
They picked up skills from the Germans and the Swedish about how to make log cabins and how to do dovetail notching. And so they weren't averse to hard work, but they did not really have a great sense about what it was like to live in the mountains, but they figured it out. And they were very resourceful and pretty much either made or grew or bartered for everything that they used and ate.
One of the best preserved mountain communities is found in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Cades Cove, located in the mountains of southern Tennessee, was believed to be settled by Europeans in 1818. It quickly grew to a full-fledged, close-knit mountain community with Baptist churches. A number of homesteads and farms. Cemeteries telling the stories of the hard life where most children died before they reached the age of 20. A large open area excellent for growing grains, particularly corn. A grist mill powered by fresh flowing water. And people who knew how to build a still. Pretty much everything needed for making whiskey.
The stereotype is that everyone knew how to make whiskey, and that is somewhat true. There were people who were teetotalers, but there were people who brought with them stills and copper to make whiskey apparatuses from the very beginning of their settlement, and so whiskey became a backwoods form of currency and an expected drink when visitors would arrive.
If you look at farm inventories, most farms had a still because it was something they did in the fall of the year with byproducts of the crops, whether it was corn or whether it was orchards being apples or peaches. And once you distilled it, it was an easier way to take it to the market. So from the 18th century on, we have it in this region.
So what did an early 19th century distilling operation look like? Fortunately, a replica of the most successful and largest distillery at the turn of the century in America has been rebuilt. Interestingly, it belonged to the nation's first president, George Washington. Once part of Washington's home, Mount Vernon, his grist mill and distillery, originally completed in 1798, have been brought back into production in the 21st century. Tours are available.
The distillery, this reconstruction right behind me, is on the same site. This is really his where it all happened. It was a late life undertaking by Washington, the last 3 years of his life, but just in that short time, it was one of his most profitable undertakings. What it basically was, it actually originated by someone other than him. In 1797, Washington left the presidency, retiring back to his beloved Mount Vernon. He was the kind of main events of his life were now behind him. His farm manager at the time, a man named was James Anderson. He's from Scotland originally, and Anderson had experience with whiskey making. He, being the manager, he knew, of course, Mount Vernon, and he recognized that this site right here, right next to the mill, which had been there for about 30 years by 1797, was ideal for a whiskey distillery. You had the mill, which provided the grains, corn, rye, barley, that we use as the ingredients for the whiskey. You had the operation of the creek right over there. So just kind of all these things together made it a good place to have one.
Inside, you'll see all the physical components needed for a distilling operation. Large wooden barrels known as mash barrels. Access to clean, cold running water from outside of the distillery. Ground up grain, malted barley, rye, and cornmeal. A source of heat. And distillery workers, in Washington's case, often enslaved black men. The distilling process starts something like this. Heat the stream water in a large tub to 172 degrees. Then, as in Washington's time, using large ladles, transfer the hot water into a mash barrel. Add the cornmeal to the water and mix by hand, stirring with large wooden rakes until a fine consistency is achieved. It's back-breaking work. Next, add the rye meal. Finally, add the malted barley. When the malt on the surface cracks, begin stirring the mash one more time. Next, mix in the yeast. In about 3 hours, the entire barrel will be fermenting, producing alcohol. In about 3 days, the mash will be ready to distill. It should be pointed out that unlike fruit juices and honey, grains are made up largely of starches, complex carbohydrate molecules. In their natural state, they are not subject to fermentation by yeast. They need to be broken down into simpler sugars by malts. The discovery of malting goes back to those ancient Mediterranean civilizations. They discovered that sprouted grains, like this barley, were found to be pleasing to the palate and to have unexpected and miraculous possibilities, including bread making. The other miracle was brewing. When sufficient sprouting of the barley seeds has occurred, a process known as kilning is initiated. In this process, warm air is passed through the grain to halt further growth. The grain is now said to be malted. Malted grains, when heated in water, release enzymes that break down the starch in corn and other grains into simple sugars that are now fermentable. In the Washington distillery, there is also the large copper still used to distill the fermented mash. Later in the program, we will visit a modern moonshine distillery and witness the distilling process firsthand. Remember, Washington was a wealthy man, so he could hire the best craftsmen to build his distillery. But if you're one of those Scotch-Irish pioneers in the Appalachians, how would you get a small backyard distilling operation going?
They would first go to a coppersmith, and most communities had a coppersmith, and they would make a turnip steel, and usually the seams would either be riveted or dovetailed, depending on the skill of the man. And you'd have the pot, the cap, and you'd have the worm. And you would need several barrels for making it, so you might have to see a cooper about making your barrels. And you would need, say, if you were corn or rye, you would need to have that, and if it was corn or rye, it would have to be ground at a grist mill. And there was always someone that knew the recipe or how to make it within a community, and you just ask someone how to make it, and they would help you, because, you know, the first tax in this country was the whiskey tax, which started the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. So it's always been taxed off and on, but people always felt it was their right to make this without the government interference.
The next question was where to place the still.
You would look for a place that was concealed from the general community, and a place that would have easy access to getting in and out of for taking supplies in and bringing product out. Around here we have a lot of mountains, a lot of the ridges and the hollers going up between the mountains, a lot of fresh water in the area, so water is not a problem, and it's just getting back within a place where you can make it and not be disturbed.
In a very short time, thousands of backyard stills sprang up in the Appalachians. Some paid taxes while others did not. Those that did not became the legendary moonshiners. The building of a legal and illegal moonshining industry that could reach customers in distant urban centers took nearly a century. It was about 40 years before George Washington's distillery that people began to realize moonshine had the potential to be a commodity, a product not just for home consumption.
Right. Well, early on, the Scots-Irish and any others who made whiskey were realizing that they had something that they could transport back to population centers where they could trade for necessities. It might be coffee or sugar or yeast or something that they couldn't just come by in their homes, salt. They realized, first of all, that they could grow corn, but corn is hard to transport because it's heavy by the bushel and it doesn't yield that much in terms of income. So if you loaded up your mules with corn, you wouldn't make very much by the time you got back home. But if you concentrated corn into liquid form and whiskey out of the mountains made with spring water with homegrown corn was a sought-after commodity, you realized, oh, if I could take a couple of barrels of this to 50 miles away and trade it and come back with some money or come back with some goods that my family really needs. And so it was early on in the 1700s that it became a commodity.
Once moonshine became a commodity, whether legal or illegal, it became a business and involved a host of players. Farmers, sugar and grain suppliers, container suppliers, still workers, still owners, liquor haulers, financial partners, and retail whiskey sellers. It was a thriving industry. Then came the American Civil War. The Civil War changed everything for the hill people of Appalachia. Since 1817, alcohol was untaxed by the federal government. But in the midst of the Civil War, Congress once more passed a whiskey tax. By 1865, the tax was $2 per gallon of liquor.
After the Civil War, Ulysses Grant, who's president, taxes again whiskey, and that's the beginning of the phenomenon that we know as the revenuer. Government revenue, the Treasury Department needs to raise money, revenue, for its projects, and some of that now was including rebuilding the South during the Reconstruction period. It needed to tax, and that was when the federal agents began going into the mountains. This is 1870s and 80s and so forth, and these created big battles. First, there was bad blood about the Civil War and federal troops coming in, federal government that, according to some people, had never helped the rural people to begin with, were now telling people that they couldn't make a few dollars off of this, and it really created a lot of animosity.
From the end of the Civil War to Prohibition in 1920, moonshining centered around wood-fired turnip stills making apple brandy or corn whiskey. Perhaps half of these distilleries went illegal and avoided paying taxes, and the other half went legal and paid the government. As the 1800s drew to a close, the national fervor against drinking and selling alcohol was gaining ground. Around the turn of the 20th century, county laws were passed, making it illegal to run a distillery in many rural areas in the South. At the same time, with improved roads and railroads, it became easier to ship alcohol, legal and illegal, from the whiskey distillers in the hills to larger urban centers. The scarcer whiskey became, the more valuable it became, especially for illegal distillers since they weren't paying taxes. It was during these days the illegal distiller came to be called a moonshiner, and later a bootlegger. One distillery that was always legal was Jim Beam Bourbon Whiskey, located around Lebanon, Kentucky. The Jim Beam story is truly an American story of family and entrepreneurship. It started with Jacob Beam.
The Beams came to Kentucky. They came from Maryland, and they came in 1788 and settled here, started growing corn and distilling, and Jacob is said to have sold his first barrel of whiskey in 1795.
The Jim Beam Fine Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey label is now owned by an international conglomerate. But seventh-generation Beam brothers, Paul and Steve, have brought the Beam family distilling tradition back to life with a micro-distillery. The Limestone Branch Distillery in Lebanon, Kentucky.
Our family, we're very proud of their heritage, and so I grew up with stories of the distilleries. We grew up with a lot of the memorabilia around and bottles. It had been on both sides of my family who had owned distilleries. And I always felt a little bit of disconnect because the distilleries were sold off right before I was born. But it just seemed like an unfinished chapter, especially on the Beam side, where my great-grandfather had the distillery and Prohibition had interrupted everything. So I just always felt it was an unfinished chapter, and we needed to continue it. So, and there were 7 generations before us, and if we would not have established the distillery, we would have broken the chain. And I couldn't let that happen on my watch. So I have to be able to hand down, to the next generation who have the opportunity to continue. So I know I've done my part.
The Beam brothers invited us inside their distillery to see how modern moonshine is made. Each day, a complete distilling cycle takes place. We join the brothers as they prepare their corn mash.
Okay, so we are adding the back set, which is the stillage that's left in the still after we distill. So we take, and we're going to add about 30% back set to our next batch. And so this is really hot, and we will add our sugar to this, cook it, mix it up, melt the sugar into there, temper the water down, and then pump it over into the barrels where the process will start back up again.
As you can see, just like in Washington's time, this is still back-breaking hard labor.
And so this is a 50% corn and 50% sugar recipe. So there's 100 pounds of corn in the barrel. So we're going to add 100 pounds of sugar. It's good to get it all mixed up really well, because you don't want to leave any sugar on the bottom. That just is leaving money on the bottom of the barrel there. Probably 2 more. And that's 140 degrees. If we were to put it in at this temperature, it would kill the yeast. After 105, you really start damaging yeast. I think it can go up a little bit higher than that, but so we shoot for right about 80 degrees.
Using an electric pump, the brothers began transferring the sugar pot of their mash into a wooden barrel containing the corn portion of the mash.
So we're mixing the sugar water into the old corn, and this actually starts back up like a sourdough starter. the yeast that was in there is not, hasn't died, so it's still active, and it will kick right back up and start going once we get the nutrients and the sugar back in where it can go. Work. I think you're probably good, huh? For a little bit. And then this will begin fermenting, and we'll ferment this out for about 4 to 5 days. And then it will have turned into what is known as distiller's beer, which is about like a sour beer, about 10% alcohol. And that's what we'll start, put in the still and start back all over again.
After 4 days of fermentation, the mash is transferred into the large copper pot still, very similar to the backwoods moonshining stills found in the Appalachian Hills.
So what we're going to do is we're going to heat this up, and as it begins to boil, the vapors start to come off at their boiling point. And the very first things that come off are methanol, acetone, things like that. Then as the temperature rises, it gets to about 173 degrees, alcohol vapors start to come off. And the alcohol will come up into the cap and then across the line arm. And what's happening here, it comes into this tank, which the distillers call a doubler. Moonshiners call this a thump keg, because as the steam comes through, this will sometimes rattle. This pipe here is about, continues down to about 1 inch off of the base. So the steam is coming down and coming all the way down. We fill this up about 1/3 of the way with faints. Some people use water or faints, which is the very first things that come off of the still. The steam is coming down, it's reboiling in this liquid, and then it exits over here. That is like a second distillation. We're leaving impurities and some more water behind. As it comes up and over and down in this tank, we've got a copper coil, and the coil, the steam is entering into the coil, and as it goes around, we're pumping cold water continuously over the coil. And that will cause the steam to condense, and as it condenses, it will come out right down here. And that will be our moonshine. Out of that 150 gallons, we'll get somewhere right about 20 gallons of 100 proof alcohol.
A typical distillation takes about 6 to 7 hours. While Steve tightens down his still, he tells us the difference between moonshine, whiskey, and bourbon.
Well, bourbon, whiskey in general, has a very strict interpretation and guidelines, and bourbon is just a subset of that whiskey. Bourbon has to be 51% corn, stored in a new charred oak barrel. It has to come off the still below 160 proof and go into a barrel below 125 proof. So it has a very rigid guidelines. Moonshine, really moonshine is just about anything that people can ferment gets put into the still and distilled off. And that could be anything from potatoes to malt, barley, corn, or fruit, depending on what part of the country or the world you're in. Moonshine is generally not aged, although some people do. So that's the difference between a whiskey and a moonshine. Generally, the makers of moonshine are out to turn it over as quickly as possible. Less chance of getting caught, and quicker to make some money.
At last, a clear liquid comes pouring out. The famous Kentucky Hills moonshine. After all the painstaking preparation, it is collected in a simple bucket.
About, like I said, 5 or 6 gallons off of here, maybe up to 10. And then we'll start collecting for what we're going to use, eventually use to bottle and to make products with.
Then it's off to bottling. In addition to its own moonshine labels, Limestone Branch Distillery bottles the original Moon Pie Moonshine. But today, they're bottling one of their distinctive moonshines.
We're bottling apple pie, which is a moonshine made with apple juice, apple cider, and pie spices. We also put a cinnamon stick in each one. This is the bottling. It's a volumetric. It's done by a timer, so it's filled to the same volume each time. And then it's all bottled and labeled by hand, and these are ready to get the labels put on them.
The brothers' prize label is T.J. Pottinger.
This is at 100 proof. The T.J. Pottinger name comes from T.J. Pottinger, who was an early settler into Kentucky, one of the first settlers to Kentucky, and he established a distillery, and my great-grandfather bought the distillery from him and continued that brand. This is, like I said, a true Appalachian style. This comes from an uncooked mash. It has not been cooked like a traditional whiskey mash. This is a corn and sugar mash. So all the alcohol is being made from the sugar that's added to the mash. It's just raw cornmeal, sugar, water, and yeast. And it ferments out in about 5 days. And it provides a lighter characteristic than a cooked mash, which is much more grain forward in the flavor. So this is 100 proof. Again, you can tell the way the bubbles flash off, and like I said, has a light nose and just a mild corn flavor.
Throughout the 1900s until Prohibition in 1920, the Beam distilling family was the most powerful in Marion County, Kentucky, becoming the largest landowner and acquiring many legal distilleries. Those days are but a memory now for the Beam brothers. Eventually, the brothers decided to take us on a tour down memory lane. First, they showed us the near ghost town of New Hope, the town that once was the center of the Beam clan, now in a state of decay. The one building that is still kept up here is the community church, a church the boys had not visited since their childhood.
All of these, the Stations of the Cross were hand-painted by an artist that came in to the community from Europe, and the stained glass was all imported and assembled locally. The altars, the side altars, and main altar were all hand-carved in Europe and brought over.
They would ring the church bells, and you definitely had to make. And they would come over here on Saturdays, and my grandmother, I remember, come over here, and of course the big thing on Saturdays was to clean the church.
Right.
I mean, that was like the thing to do, and I remember her coming over here a lot of Saturdays, and they would clean this church spotless.
Yeah. A lot of weddings, a lot of funerals, a lot of masses. So, but it actually scared me to death when I was young.
Where they really wanted to take us was the ruins of an early family distillery, a key distillery in Beam family history.
This is the old Yellowstone property in Gethsemane, Kentucky. It started out as my MC Beam and Company, and Minor Case Beam sold his distillery to Bernard Dant, and they made Yellowstone whiskey here. So these are the old mash tub sites. There's 7 tubs, 1 for every day. And come on back, and looks like he's been selling the bricks. I need to get over here. He said we could have some. I need to get over here and get some more.
They said the still was here just a few years ago. What did they say?
Yeah.
They pulled the still out.
Yeah. This would have been the boiler over here, and yeah, this was actually just burned not too long ago. They said it was full of marijuana, and somebody got a tip that the police were coming, and rather get caught, they burned it up.
We have the railroad tracks behind there, where it was easy access to the railroad to load up and ship product in and out. So it was right there, went to downtown Louisville.
Yeah, but it's the one thing that has always inspired us, to kind of get into the business is when you walk around the property that that your great-grandfather walked around the same property, 100 years ago. It's, you feel a close tie.
Every distilling operation needed clear spring water. This one was no exception.
You've got the old mash tubs, and like Paul said, there's a spring over here, and there's another spring over here. Of course, limestone water being the essential part of the process, a good spring was always important.
As we saw, the mash tubs here were huge, just as any major label's tubs would be today.
Those were warehouses and bottling facility up on the hill. And of course you see the water tower.
This was a huge pre-Prohibition operation, complete with a guard tower and distilling operation, employing many workers.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can get over there or not. It might be a little bit too much like reality TV if we go over there.
Indeed, there are many ghosts in the shadows here. When Prohibition was enacted in 1920, the Beam family moved their operation to Canada. But most of the Scotch-Irish were not so lucky. They had to stay and deal with a law that took away their livelihood. A livelihood that now became illegal and part of the bootlegging industry. These ordinary farmers became outlaws. From that point on, moonshiners developed a unique Southern outlaw image. Today, our fascination with the moonshiner is part nostalgia, part love of the anti-hero. Indeed, in the South especially, the noble person who pushes the boundaries of the law in an effort to make a living is celebrated. No one personified this Southern anti-hero image better than Major Lewis Redmond, a dapper Robin Hood-like mountain outlaw and moonshiner. A moonshiner that became known as the Prince of Dark Corners. Redmond was born in the mid-1850s in the hills of North Carolina. He was an experienced distiller of moonshine by the time he was 21. On March 1st, 1876, he was apprehended at gunpoint by a young deputy U.S. Marshal while driving a wagon load of liquor. Legend has it that Redmond produced a small Derringer and from point-blank range shot the U.S. Marshal. The 24-year-old lawman died shortly thereafter. From that day, Redmond went on the run and was eager to play the role of anti-hero. His name became a rallying cry for fellow distillers, eager to champion the man who was fighting the revenuers and winning. 2 years later, upward of 30 men rode with Redmond's various gangs through the following months. They were pursued with a hail of bullets by dozens of revenue officers through the Blue Ridge Mountains. Covered by all the major newspapers, Redmond's fame grew, and with it the mystique of the outlaw mountain moonshiner. Finally, in 1881, a party of 6 agents trapped Redmond in his house. The New York Times reported that in spite of being surrounded, he nevertheless tried to escape and was shot 6 times. He ran half a mile before the exhaustion and blood loss caused him to collapse. The Times also prematurely reported his death. However, Redmond, true to his legend, had a tough constitution that fully complemented his rowdy disposition. He survived to live peacefully another 25 years. But the mystique of this Appalachian moonshine outlaw through dime store novels and newspaper accounts has been firmly implanted in the psyche of the American public. And the region itself became known as the place of dangerous, dark corners and shadows.
Every community has the shadows and the dark spots and the people within the community that we wish weren't there. We don't have any more or any less than any other community, I don't think. We all have our problems. It just depends on how much television and the newspapers play them up and make of it.
As we have just seen, occasionally lawless and violent, those early Scotch-Irish pioneers nevertheless had a major influence on the history of the United States. Eventually, the descendants of those early homesteaders would go on to populate many frontier areas beyond Appalachia. And much of their culture, customs, and speech are still visible and play a large role in parts of the South today. Perhaps most remarkably, producing 11 American presidents, starting with the 7th, Andrew Jackson. But when it's all said and done, those intrepid, ingenious Scotch-Irish pioneers did something else. They turned the hills of Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee into the whiskey, bourbon, and moonshine center of America, creating the major labels that are still on the shelves of every liquor store today. As the 20th century dawned, America was on the fast track to becoming the dominant economic power among nations. The country now stretched from sea to sea, connected by 4 intercontinental railroads. Teddy Roosevelt would become the grand reformer president. The Wright brothers would fly the first airplane at Kitty Hawk. World War I would thrust America onto the world stage. Henry Ford's Model T would put all Americans on the road. And through all of this, the legal and illegal distillation of liquor would establish the hills of southern Appalachia as the moonshine and bourbon capital of the world. As noted journalist Eric Burns wrote in his book, The Spirits of America, A Social History of Alcohol. Booze was the food, medicine, and companionship in the early days of America. Alcoholic beverages would serve as the almost indispensable complement to liberty, sparking the urge to separate from the motherland, igniting patriotism, stroking the passion for growth and prosperity, as if freedom were an engine, spirits the fuel. Indeed, among the nation's founding fathers, George Washington once owned the largest distillery in the country. John Adams was notorious for his drinking. Jefferson was a proud winemaker. And Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Behold the rain which descends from heaven upon our vineyards. There it enters the roots of the vines to be changed into wine." A constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy. But looming on the horizon was a dark force that would change everything for the country. And in particular, change everything for the Appalachian distilleries. The passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919 banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol. The manufacture and sale of alcohol that had been a way of life for over 150 years in the Southern Appalachians. Prior to the American Revolution, Germans, and particularly the Scotch-Irish looking for land, emigrated to the American colonies.
Whiskey making, moonshining in this country came over with the Scotch-Irish, which would have been back in the middle 1700s, when the lowland Scots, which were transplanted up into Northern Ireland, got disgusted with the English and started coming to the United States and wound up in the Appalachian Mountains up there, drifted on down into what we call the Deep South now, but they brought with them the culture of whiskey. Now, in the Gaelic language, whiskey means the water of life. This was very important, these people, and they started making moonshine in the hills, and they brought it on down, and finally they get down into places like Mississippi, where I grew up, and an area of Meridian, which is in the hills, not the flat country, not the Delta, but in the hills over in East Mississippi, where the Scotch-Irish came from South Carolina, in the hills of South Carolina, and settled there. And they started making moonshine whiskey there and selling it. And in fact, they still do, because I bought some not long ago.
However, in the beginning, the steep slopes and small rocky valleys of the Appalachian Mountains made farming difficult. A subsistence lifestyle based on the concept of make do or do without permeated the life of these early pioneers. Food was grown, hunted, and gathered. Shelter, clothing, and bedding were made with simple tools from local resources. Water was supplied by cold mountain springs. Bartering and trading were the common forms of exchange. Acquiring goods you could not produce on your own. And cash money was always in short supply. These hardy pioneers lived in communities of large, extended families. In these remote and isolated mountain settlements of Appalachia, hardy men and women had to possess the skills and ingenuity to make do in many unique ways. And moonshining was one. The distillation of grain into whiskey was an old-world skill brought from Ireland and Germany that soon flourished anew in the Appalachians. If these mountain men and women wanted to drink whiskey, they had to make it themselves.
The technology in Kentucky came from Scotch, Irish that came in, and also English, German, but I think a lot of it came from being self-sufficient in these farms and just being totally self-sufficient, not being able to go to the store or go somewhere to get things. So a lot of it, people had the skills, developed skills to survive. In true American ingenuity, they used everything. There were a lot of log and wood fermentation tanks. J.W. Dant, my great-great-grandfather, began his distilling, what they called distilling on the log. And he hollowed out a poplar tree and did the fermentation in the poplar tree. There was a coil, copper coil in there, where he would run steam through the copper coil when it was finished, and he had a copper cap. So the tree was the vessel, and with a copper cap, and that's how he started. So there was just a lot of ingenuity in the methods that people would use. Of course, if people could afford, they'd have a copper still, but they would distill in just about any way that they could distill something.
The main subsistence food crop that grew well in the small valleys and hollows of the mountains was corn. Corn that would become the dominant grain for whiskey production. First, the corn was crushed and mixed with water to create a mixture called mash. Mash was left to ferment in open barrels for 4 to 5 days, producing still beer, a mild alcoholic liquid that was then cooked in a copper still pot, causing vapor to run through the worm, a spiraling copper coil in a bucket of cold water, where it condensed back into a liquid form and dripped into another container. This liquid was 100 proof clear corn whiskey. Beginning in the early 1800s, but particularly after the Civil War, those hardy Scotch-Irish mountaineers finally had a lucrative cash market for their corn crop, provided they sold it by the gallon instead of the bushel. That crop was moonshine, distilled corn whiskey, a much sought-after commodity generated by legal and illegal stills in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Roddy Moore is the director of the Blue Ridge Institute and Museum in Ferrum, Virginia. He showed us their collection of backwoods stills.
Okay, the oldest style of making whiskey would have been in a copper pot like this. And this would have been made by a coppersmith, and you can see the rivets where it's put together, and that's probably about a 75-gallon pot. Now, a modern-day interpretation of that is this pot, which was made and used in Roanoke, Virginia in the area, and it's rather unusual that someone in this region was still working in a copper pot. But if you're making brandy, you pretty well want to make it in copper. Or a lot of people, the older people in the region, feel that, you make better whiskey with copper. Now, what our community has gone to is this, and it's called a submarine. And the sub probably came into use in the 20s and 30s, and this is a small one. They've made them as big as 850 gallons. Your cap fit on the top, you put all your mash and everything in here, and you heat under the bottom. And the unusual thing about usually with a lot of the subs, especially present day, if you look right over here, you'll see this burner. And see, in modern days, a lot of people have gone, no one uses wood or coal for fire anymore. They use bottle gas, because with bottle gas, there's no smoke or anything, and you can get a fire anywhere. So you use a burner like that under the still. You can control the heat, the temperature, the flame, and you have better control of the whole process. But this copper pot right here was the older style, and this, even though it's a small one, the sub, is what people have gone to today.
With the passing of Prohibition, Appalachian distilleries now had to make a decision. Making illegal whiskey was no longer a simple matter of avoiding taxes. It was now unconstitutional and a crime against the federal government. A government many believed did nothing for them.
These small distilleries right before Prohibition that had already gotten legal licenses were sending out notices to all their customers, you better buy it now because it's going to go away. Buy it by the case. It did go away. Some of those same people, there were people on the census prior to 1919 in little places like the Virginia community where I come from, listing on the census distillery worker. It was a job that people were proud to list. It wasn't anything illegal. Suddenly all of those people are out of jobs. What are they going to do? They then go into producing whiskey in the shadows, in the hollows, in the places where the government couldn't find them.
I think for a lot of these guys, moonshining was a way of life. It was a way to live a bigger life than the one that they might have otherwise lived if they stayed on the farm or worked in the local mill. There just weren't a whole lot of economic opportunities for a lot of these guys throughout the South. And I think a lot of them found that with moonshining, they could make a better living, a more lucrative living than they would have otherwise. And it was also kind of fun and adventurous and exciting. And they could be their own boss and make their own hours. Of course, there were the risks that went with it as well.
Those people were now being recruited by what would eventually become the mafia or the people connected to them, maybe several steps away, but eventually this was making the bad guys a new form of profit making.
The dream of Prohibition was absurdly simple. Stop alcohol, and America would become heaven on earth. The reality, however, could not have been further from that dream. In fact, Prohibition was a colossal failure that had the exact opposite effect. It gave rise to illegal saloons known as speakeasies, set off the deadliest, most violent era of American history since the Civil War. And it created organized crime commonly called the Mafia. All fueled by Americans craving illegal booze. A craving that Southern moonshiners were all too happy to oblige. The largest markets for the moonshiners were America's biggest East Coast and Midwest cities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit. It was here that the thirst for the best illegal booze in the country was greatest. It was also here where the profits were greatest, bigger than the profits of Ford and General Motors combined. And it was here that the risk to the Southern moonshiners was greatest, because the gangs, later known as the Mafia, controlled the distribution and sale of their illegal booze. These city gangs the moonshiners had to deal with began in Old World Sicily. Known as the Sicilian Mafia, they were basically family-run enterprises. The patriarch of a Sicilian family was the patron, or godfather, who doled out favors to his soldiers. It was a system based on three principles: a strict code of loyalty, an equally rigid code of silence known as omerta, and the liberal use of the vendetta. ritual murder to pay back offenses and killings by one family against another. If a member broke any of the rules, he was killed. It was a harsh life that favored the strong, the ruthless, and those who vowed loyalty to the family above all else. A life that would lead to vicious feuds between mafia families and the deadliest gangsters in American history. Gangsters whose names would be emblazoned in American folklore. Monsters like Al Capone, Dutch Schultz, Bugs Moran, and Dean O'Banion. Chicago's notorious mob boss Al Capone was the embodiment of ruthlessness and violence in bootleg liquor. By supplying illegal alcohol to Chicago's hundreds of speakeasies, Capone rose quickly to control Chicago's underworld. On the way up, Capone's extreme violence would become legendary. He was behind the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where 6 members of rival Bugs Moran's Irish gang were cornered in a warehouse and riddled with bullets. Soon after, Capone personally killed 3 gang members who had betrayed him, brutally bludgeoning them to death with a baseball bat. When discovered the next day by police, the 3 men were unrecognizable. Some of the most notorious gangs were immigrants from Ireland who arrived after the Protestant Scotch-Irish and were largely Catholics. These Irish mobsters would leave their bloody fingerprints all over the decade of the Roaring Twenties. And like their counterparts in the Appalachian Hills, all the big city mafia gangs learned to use the huge wealth generated from the sale of illegal liquor to bribe and control law enforcement, judges, and politicians. In an odd twist of fate, big city mafiosos were the people Southern moonshiners would have to deal with if they were going to make a killing by selling their bootleg whiskey. Charlie Thompson, who wrote the definitive book on the Appalachia moonshiners, Spirits of Just Men, learned that most of the Appalachian whiskey makers had no choice except to become criminals in the eyes of the federal government.
Some people made a huge killing off of it. A lot of people went to jail, and a whole lot of people remained poor, but they still were able to make a few dollars to feed their families. And that's the kind of rhetoric that I was hearing as I was doing research for my book. We had to do this. And remember, right around that time, there was an agricultural depression. We know that in 1929, the stock market crashed. But a decade prior to that, agricultural prices crashed. Right after World War I, when demand had skyrocketed because we were supplying troops in the European theater. When the war ends in 1919, we have plummeting demand. Prices drop for corn. Prices drop to below the cost of production. So farmers are already in depression a decade before 1929. And if you're a small farmer with only 50 acres, much of which is hardly cultivatable, then you're really in dire circumstances. So whiskey in some cases was the only way that some families fed themselves. And again, they were selling it to buy food. Some people did pretty well. People that I know say that they had shoes sometimes because their fathers were hauling or making moonshine, and the ones who didn't have that in their homes could always tell who whose daddy was making a little money on the side because of what they had in their lunch buckets, or that the fact that they wore shoes, or that they had a change of clothes. These people were not getting filthy rich, but they were clearly putting shoes on their children's feet. That's a saying that I heard many times.
Okay. Well, here
Steve Beam is a seventh-generation distiller of the Jim Beam Bourbon Empire.
a moonshine made with
He explains how the Hill people justified their illegality.
the entire economy in this area revolved around distilleries. People either working in the distilleries, they were growing grain for the distilleries, making barrels, the labels, just the whole economy. And so Prohibition comes, and they've taken everybody's livelihood away, and all the distilleries closed. People were forced out of work. That's when this whole notion of God's law and man's law started to come out in this area. And you know, you have God's law, which you follow, but man's laws are not quite as important as what God had said. So that's, I think, a way a lot of people justified being in the moonshine business, and also just the fact that they had to feed the families. I mean, you know, there was just no way to make a living in this area. So I tell people, you were either on the law enforcement side, chasing people, or you were on the moonshine side, either bootlegging or running liquor, making liquor. So there were just two sides of the economy, but it all revolved around that economy.
The conflict between the so-called revenuers and the Appalachia Hill people goes back to the 19th century, when the liquor tax was the second largest form of tax revenue for the U.S. government. Of course, the extension of federal taxing power to cover homemade whiskey was fiercely resisted by the Hill people, who had long relied on distilling to produce an easily transportable and readily sellable product made from their corn. Many were quite unwilling to be taxed or regulated. As a result, the collection of whiskey taxes required the creation of the most extensive civilian law enforcement agency in the nation's history, the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The Bureau both regulated tax-paying distilleries and combated illicit production. This battle against moonshiners laid the groundwork for a federal authority capable of reaching into the most remote parts of the nation. Originally, in the 1800s, revenuers used strong military-style action. Moonshiners often fought back, killing over 20 U.S. Marshals. But that all changed in the 20th century, when moonshiners, in most cases, no longer fought the law. Instead, they were always prepared to flee and build another still the next day. In 1919, the passage of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, prohibiting the production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors, changed the game one more time. The Volstead Act followed the same year, giving the federal government sweeping powers to enforce prohibition. With it came the birth of the present-day ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, in 1920, when it was made an independent agency within the Treasury Department. This agency has been in constant battle with the illegal moonshining industry. The ATF's agents, sometimes overzealous, sometimes notorious, sometimes vindictive, sometimes heroic, sometimes bribable, were given the job to end bootlegging.
Bootleg, the sort of literal meaning is that there was a whiskey bottle could fit down in one's boot. And the bootlegging would be you could pull it out at times when in secret. And you could sell, it began to mean that you could sell by the drink, and there were speakeasies in urban areas as well as rural. There was a place in the county where I came from where people would gather and go into a back room and they could buy liquor by the drink. That would be called bootlegging. But eventually all of it became bootlegging for people in my community. And I call it moonshining now because people seem to get that term a little better, but that's not how it was referred to in the 1930s in rural Virginia.
Inside a barrel, deep within an Appalachian hollow, and far from the long arms of the law, is where moonshine begins its long journey to the cities. In many cases, it was the revenuer's goal to find these stills and destroy them. It was a grand cat-and-mouse game. And the moonshiners had many tricks up their sleeves. We find that the use of telephones, firing of guns, ringing of farm bells, blowing of hunting horns, smoke signals, ladies hanging washing on clotheslines, and various other signals are preventing captures of stills and operators. Revenue Agent L.E. Bridges, Franklin County, 1926. In the beginning, a moonshiner would set up a well-hidden still. The law officers would learn about it from an informant, and the federal agents would raid the still site. Agents and other law officials used axes, or in some cases dynamite, to destroy all the still parts and mashed containers. Often waiting in ambush, the big hope was to catch the moonshiner in the act of cooking up his brew. If a moonshiner ran, the agents followed in pursuit. Often the moonshiner, because he knew the countryside better, would escape. One famous moonshiner said he never wore shoes at the still site because he could run faster barefoot. But when caught red-handed at the still or in a chase, the moonshiner usually accepted his fate. Rarely was there any gunplay or real violence. But trying to locate the still site was just the beginning of the cat-and-mouse game between revenuers and bootleggers. There were many more opportunities to play the game as the whiskey moved on towards the city.
So you have the small farmers, small producers, gradually being encouraged to either grow their business size because there's more demand from outside the community. There are people who are becoming really good at being middlemen. Some guy who's an entrepreneur or someone who has knowledge about the law enforcement strategies from federal down to the county, who can figure out how to move whiskey.
Of course, the Prohibition-era bootlegging business, centered in the Appalachian Hills, would not have been possible without Henry Ford and his Model T. The Model T was introduced on October 1st, 1908. The car was very simple to drive and easy and cheap to repair. By the 1920s, a majority of American drivers, including the young sons of moonshiners, had learned to drive on the Model T. Neil Thompson has written a book, Driving with the Devil. In it, he paints a picture of the connection between the illegal moonshine business and the rise of the American automobile.
A lot of the moonshiners, they had to make their stuff, out in the country somewhere to avoid detection. They also needed a reliable source of water. So a lot of these stills would be set up next to a creek, up in the hills somewhere, where they could build their still get the water over to the still, they would bring in their sugar and their corn and mix it right there next to the creek. But then, of course, they needed to get it from that spot down to the cities. So they wind their way down these dirt roads, down to a country road, and then eventually onto the bigger roads, getting closer and closer to the city. What I found interesting is that because of that sort of delivery system from way up in the hills down to the cities, these guys learned to drive really well and often quite fast.
Imagine yourself racing down the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains. The heavy load of liquor making driving very difficult, if not impossible. Then, in the rearview mirror, appear the flashing lights of the law. Your adrenaline pumps into overdrive and the chase is on. As you whip down a narrow, rutted and rocky road, revenuers in hot pursuit. It was one of the great thrills of any country boy's life, and he could get rich beyond his wildest dreams doing it.
There were back roads and there were dirt roads that connected these places. There began to be people who knew how to drive really well. And, you know, in some cases they learned how to drive as farmers. They knew how to drive trucks. They were hauling corn or they were hauling fertilizer or whatever it was. And some young people who were growing up in poverty began to realize that this was one ticket out. That if they could become drivers as teenagers and all they would have to do is drive a load over the mountains into the West Virginia coal fields or over to the biggest town where it then could be transported to some of the cities up north, then they had a way to make a living.
The drivers who transported moonshine from the stills located in the hills to the big city mafiosos were immortalized in Thunder Road, a classic 1958 black and white hillbilly noir movie about hauling moonshine in the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee in the late 1950s. Filled with dramatic car pursuits between the law and a rebel moonshine driver, played by Robert Mitchum, the film forever made the daring and dramatic car chase a staple of every action film thereafter. However, back in the 20s and 30s, the cat and mouse game played out on the roads of Appalachia, though less dramatic, was even more dangerous.
You have the great stories of people being chased by the police, and in this region, if you're chased by the police and you can outrun them and get far enough ahead, a lot of times they'll just run the car over the side of the hill and jump out and run and leave the car because the car is registered under a fictitious name, the tags are a fictitious name, and that's just one of the losses of business, is losing the car.
So there were sort of two stages during the period I read about in my book. One is the Prohibition era, where it's just flat out illegal to make your own liquor, and it's illegal to drink it, it's illegal to sell it, no matter what, it's all against the law. 1933, that ends. Prohibition comes to an end in various stages along the way, but eventually we get to this point where it's no longer illegal to sell or drink whiskey or other liquors, but it is still illegal to make it and sell it without paying the tax man, basically. The government wanted its cut of all alcohol sales. And so even though you get to this point where it's finally legal to make the stuff, if you're not paying the revenue man, it's still illegal. And that's where this cat and mouse game continued. No longer was it just the local sheriff trying to bust the moonshine makers. It was the revenue man trying to bust them because they were making it illegally by not paying their share to the government. And so during this period, during Prohibition and after Prohibition, there were plenty of car chases going on. Either the local sheriff chasing these guys, trying to catch them with their delivery of moonshine, or the revenue man, sort of the infamous revenue man chasing these guys, trying to bust them and nail them on pretty much like tax evasion charges. They should have been paying their share on their moonshine. And the revenue guys, at some point into the 1930s, they became pretty notorious and pretty hardcore, let's say. The government started recruiting some of these revenuers from the FBI Academy, from police academies, picking out the best, toughest guys to go after these moonshiners, because it was no easy thing to catch them. They were learning to drive fast in their souped up cars, and so the revenuers needed to find a way to keep up and keep up with them.
Growing up in the hills, everybody knew somebody who either made or hauled moonshine. To this day, moonshining still goes on in the deep shadows of the hills. And the code of silence surrounding illegal moonshining during Prohibition is still alive. Alive and maintained as a dark secret. A secret always clouded over by the outlaw nature of moonshining enterprises of these otherwise God-fearing people. Rebecca Austin grew up in the hills and is now manager of the Blue Ridge Institute Farm Museum in Franklin County, Virginia.
Here we have our distillery yard, and it is a replica of what a farm family of German descent in the very early 1800s would have had. We don't have it all finished yet, but the still house is here, and then a shed for storage. So that's what we've got here. To tell you the truth, I've learned more about moonshine working here than I ever knew before. I mean, of course, growing up here, it's there, it happens, it's just a part of the culture. Although I'm told my dad and my uncles ran a welding shop and tractor dealership, and I'm told occasionally copper pieces would show up in their truck in the middle of the night at their house, and they knew what to do with them. They would take them to the shop and make the needed repairs and leave them in their truck and go on to bed, and the next morning there'd be a $5 bill laying in the truck. This would have been back in the 50s. On my grandfather's home place, I understand there was a still that my uncle that owned that property when I was growing up, there was a still on the back side of it, and it wasn't his, but somebody put it on his property, and he probably knew who it belonged to.
My grandfather was a driver who was, as a teenager, drove into West Virginia, and I didn't find out until I was in around 40 that why he went to West Virginia. He just told me that he went there to work, which was true. But then later, the year that he died, he told me that he had moonshine in the back of the car, and that they would do it with a caravan of drivers, and often the one in the rear of the caravan would swerve back and forth so that the deputy couldn't pass the group. If the deputies could get in front of the group, they could block the road. But if they were behind trying to pass, they simply, all they could do was try to shoot out the tires of the cars in front of them. In many cases, those cars were souped up to the point that they could outrun the deputies. And that also gave rise to a whole new industry of people who knew how to work on cars.
First, they had to learn how to transform their cars and trucks into efficient delivery vehicles.
Some of them would take the back seats out of the car so that they could cram more moonshine in there. They would improve the suspension so it could hold a heavier load. And so along the way, they really learned to be ace mechanics because they were turning Henry Ford's cars into things that they weren't intended to be, which is moonshine delivery vehicles. And then the other thing that the moonshiners really focused on was the engines. Because they were getting chased by these revenuers, they needed to make sure their cars were going faster than the other guy. And so they started to experiment, doing things to Ford's engines that he never intended to happen, all in an effort to make them go a little bit faster. So they would drill holes, they would work on the exhaust system, they would try and get more air and gas flowing into the engine, anything they could do to just get a little more horsepower out of it.
Eventually, the question would come up: who had the fastest car among the moonshine haulers?
Interestingly, along the way, these guys are separately souping up their own cars, trying to create these high-performance moonshine vehicles. And eventually this sort of sense of competition comes into play, where the best moonshiners from certain regions wanted to find out who had the best, fastest moonshining car. And at some point they started racing each other. And it evolved sort of in rough stages along the way. Sometimes it was just a handful of moonshiners on a Sunday out in a field somewhere racing each other in a circle to see who had the fastest car. And little by little, this competition among the bootleggers draws a crowd. And then the races get a little more formalized. They draw even bigger crowds. They start holding them, instead of out at some farmer's field in the middle of nowhere, they'll start racing each other at a horse track or at a county fairgrounds. And eventually you get some smart businessmen realizing, hey, all these bootlegging cars racing each other, people want to see it, people need some entertainment on the weekends, why don't I put up some grandstands and start charging admission?
The many stories of the cat and mouse game between Prohibition revenuers and bootleggers are legendary. But of all the places where these stories happened, one county in western Virginia tops all the others. That county is Franklin County. During Prohibition, local folks named Franklin County the Moonshine Capital of the world. Without a doubt, moonshine production and bootlegging drove the region's economy. It is claimed that in the 1920s, 99 of every 100 Franklin County residents were in some way involved in the illegal liquor trade. Local bootleggers were entwined with gangsters from Chicago and other major cities. Indeed, as the booze money flowed into the county, local law enforcement officials increasingly became part of the moonshining business. A business so large that between 1930 and 1935, the amount of moonshine Franklin County still operators sold would have generated $5,500,000 in excise taxes. At the same time, Franklin County is one of the most beautiful places in the country. It's nestled amidst the Blue Ridge Mountains, where tourists and locals alike stop for breathtaking views of the glorious blue hue the mountains take when seen from a distance. As one local poet wrote, "Mountains envy show their color of blue as they look down at trees dressed in green, of their new spring look, and the flowers awake shimmer with delight, rainbow colors dripping with dew. Creeks and streams, as we listen to trickling, are talking to nature. Awake from your wintry sleep. Rise high and be true all the colors, red, white, and blue. Rise to the artist and the maker of you." On the other hand, step off the beaten path. Walk through the undergrowth along any clear water stream and you'll find dark shadows of the county's history. Places where bootleggers set up their stills. The shadowy secrets of Franklin County were largely kept from the world until the publication of a 2008 historical novel by Matt Bondurant, The Wettest County in the World. The novel is told from the perspectives of three Franklin County brothers, the Bondurant brothers. Set in 1931, the book depicts how the brothers stand up to a brutal federal agent from Chicago who demands a large take of their moonshine profits. Eventually, a violent confrontation ensues. The book was dramatized by the 2012 hillbilly noir film Lawless. By and large, the book, the movie, and Franklin County's reputation was based on what transpired during what has been called the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial in 1935. A trial reported at the time to the nation and the world by Sherwood Anderson. Anderson was the one who proclaimed Franklin County the wettest county in the world.
Sherwood Anderson, writer who had moved to the mountains of Virginia from New Orleans in the 20s, and there are problems with Sherwood Anderson's take on the world, but he did do a good job of understanding the people who lived around him. He often joked about maybe they wouldn't understand why he lived in the community. He would get on a wagon behind a slow-walking horse and with his reins and actually write some as the horse walked through the community, and people couldn't understand that. They thought he was some sort of a spy from the government, but he did get it, and he went to this trial that was in Roanoke, Virginia, that had to do with the local sheriff and the Commonwealth attorney, many people say, coercing, extorting the money from the moonshiners and building basically a pyramid of producers, and he's at the top, and the Commonwealth attorney and the law enforcement officers are getting people to make moonshine for them. And they were charging them $25 a batch and $10 a load to haul it out and they would let them get through free of arrest if they would pay this bribe. So, except it wasn't a bribe, it was extortion, because people felt they had to do it in order to survive and to make a living.
At the time, the tense trial was the longest in Virginia history. The murders, high-profile defendants, and mystique of moonshining made the conspiracy trial front-page news everywhere.
Extortion by the county law enforcement officers leads to this federal investigation that then indicts all of those people. Some 200 people were indicted, some of the most wealthy people in the county, not the small producers. To the federal government's credit, they didn't go after what my grandfather would have called the little man. They went after the big man, and lots of them. And they had people lining up for witnesses before the grand jury and so forth, and some of my family members did go as witnesses for that.
Some of those witnesses, the moonshine haulers, said they had moved more than 1 million gallons of whiskey out of the county during the period covered in the indictment. Traveling in caravans at high speed with pilot cars running interference to ward off any officers that tried to stop them. One of those haulers was a woman, the legendary Mrs. Willie Carter Sharp, who said she moved more than 220,000 gallons between 1926 and 1933. The trial lasted 10 weeks and went to jury on June 29, 1935. A verdict was reached 2 days later. 20 of the 23 defendants were found guilty. In typical Southern style, good old boy justice, the ringleader, Carter Lee, the Virginia State Attorney, and 2 deputies were acquitted. Most of the rest received light sentences and were reportedly back in business before they even started serving their jail times. When the Depression came to an end with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II, many Southern boys went off to war. When they came back, they found a different world, a richer world. A world where dirt track modified moonshine car racing was about to take off and become the biggest sport in the South.
This style of racing, the bootleggers racing each other, and then other sort of good old boys learning how to fix up their cars and participate in these races, it began in the 1930s. There was this lull during World War II. Then it really picks up after World War II. A lot of these guys who served overseas, they come back, they got a taste of adventure and danger and risk when they were fighting at war, and came back home, and a lot of them really threw themselves back into this style of racing. And so that's when the sport really started to take off. At the same time, America was kind of riding high. People had a few dollars in their pocket thanks to the wartime economy. So these races, which at one point were just, on a little horse track or a fairgrounds track, they start to grow. The crowds start to grow. In part, this is because in the South there really weren't a whole lot of professional sports, spectator sports that people could go see on the weekends. So through the 1940s, NASCAR grew because of that hunger for a spectator sport, because of that sense of adventure that the racers had and came back from World War II with. And so the sport really becomes more popular through the 1940s, and it gets to the point where somebody needs to figure out how to organize all this. Up until that point, it had been just happening here and there, sort of local guys putting together their own races. You start to see this circuit develop, where word of mouth connects the different racetracks, and the racers start going from city to city, trying out different racetracks, and you see the first stars of the sport and the first team owners emerge. And it was at 1947 where finally somebody tries to get his hands around it all, and that's Bill France, who becomes the head of the first real legitimate racing organization for stock car racing, which is known as NASCAR.
As for illegal distilling, post-war moonshining continued, as did the hauling, only now with better and faster cars.
Probably more people that race for NASCAR claim they haul liquor than ever did. It's part of the folklore and part of the story. There were people that were very good drivers on the highway and just couldn't drive in that circle track at all. But there have been some very good ones in this area that could switch from one to the other, and they all had modified cars. And in the 40s and 50s was the heyday of the modified cars, and the real tie, as far as I'm concerned, with NASCAR are the people that built the cars, the people that could build the suspension so that, regardless of how big a load you had on it, the car didn't look like it was loaded. The motors, whether they put in a Cadillac or Oldsmobile, or what type of motor they put into a different car, that had a lot of low-end torque and could really pull off. Overdrive transmissions to give them that fourth gear at that time. There were people that were real specialists in loading a car, that they said they could load more cases than anyone else, and it was how you would load a car and get as much in it as you could. So there have been specialists all along the way that could build certain cars, do certain things, and then there were certain people that were just haulers, and they were the drivers, the transporters as they're called. And today a transporter might be driving a Ford Econovan or a pickup truck with a camper shell on the back, a horse trailer with 2 horses in the back and the whole front of it loaded. It's deception, and that's what it is today. Today you don't have the big high-powered race cars, but it's more in dealing with deception.
Indeed, the demand for moonshine in some ways has never diminished. In good old Franklin County in 1972, the largest bust in history took place when agents discovered an assembly line moonshining distillery. It contained over 17 submarine stills with 24,800-gallon capacity. Moonshining is still a business for a hard-working man, as it has always been for over 250 years. In the 21st century, as reported in USA Today, there's a huge revival of interest in purchasing and drinking old-fashioned moonshine. If any single individual deserves credit for the public's current appetite for moonshine, illicit or otherwise, it is surely Marvin Popcorn Sutton. Sutton became the stereotypical overall-clad, bearded hillbilly prototype with a high musical voice and a spry, jerky carriage. Sutton always claimed to have come from a long line of mountain moonshiners, and he built a cultish notoriety based on the independently produced 2002 documentary, "This is the Last Damn Run of Liquor I'll Ever Make." In it, he builds a backwoods still from scratch. His popularity continued to grow as he appeared in documentary films and cable TV shows. In 2008, he was raided by authorities. Rather than face jail time, he committed suicide. There is even a moonshine recipe named after him and sold across the country. And does moonshining still go on today? News flash from Franklin County, March 5th, 2014. Last week, after a months-long investigation, agents found 150 gallons of untaxed liquor and a small stash of narcotics. The release said criminal charges are pending in that discovery. One more echo of bootlegging, Southern style.
You had a strong Sicilian mafia in New Orleans, and always they still do. The Dixie Mafia was not operating really out of New Orleans. They would be out in the nearby towns like Mississippi, the small towns, and they would get hooked up with this bunch with the real Italian Mafia and do things together. But they didn't operate much in New Orleans itself. You didn't fool with the Italians, that's too dangerous, unless they had something going together. But they got into dope, running dope and assassinations, hitmen. They got into burglaries, but what they would do is they'd hear about a big gambling thing going on somewhere, and they'd show up there and take all the money. I think the Dixie Mafia, you could pretty well localize it from Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. It might be a little bit here and there they might call the Dixie Mafia, but you could throw in maybe Alabama.
In those small towns and cities, the Deep South's mafiosos were as cruel, calculating, and deadly as any Italian or Sicilian crime family.
Some of these characters are fairly notorious. Louise Hathcock, Carl Towhead White, these were people that, depending on who you read, they killed people, they ordered hits, they were willing to go to virtually any extreme to protect their pecuniary interests in their criminal empires. And they were not above taking it to extreme levels of violence.
In this program, we will travel to the home of Walking Tall fame Buford Pusser, the one man who was willing to take on the Dixie Mafia. There we will hear from his daughter, Dwana, as she tells the story of her daddy's heroic life and tragic death.
You could tell there was a car and something had happened. And she said, "Oh my God, is that Buford? Has he had a wreck?" And I said, "Miss Shirley, don't say that, don't say that." So we went down the hill, back up, and sure enough, there was Daddy's car and it had hit the embankment. There was 2 transfer trucks that had pulled over. I get out and I go running to him. and he's laying down, he's laying face down. Daddy was mumbling, and of course I was screaming, Daddy, 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 Daddy. And I turned him over and was holding his neck, and I was saying, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy don't die, Daddy don't die. And whether he said it or whether he knew it, maybe I just want to believe it, but I believe he was trying to say, Dwana, Dwana, Dwana. So he died in my arms.
And finally, we will see how Kentucky's center of traditional bourbon making became home to the largest illegal marijuana growing operation in the country.
But when they were arrested, nobody talked at all. They said the Sicilian Mafia has nothing on these people because they couldn't break anybody.
These stories and more in the Southern Mob, A.K.A. the Dixie Mafia, as a battle between good and evil played out in the shadows of the small towns in the Deep South, even into the 21st century. When World War II came to an end, the Southern boys, who went off to fight around the globe, came back to a region largely unchanged by the progress that was sweeping the rest of the nation. The South's medium-sized cities, small towns, and rural areas seemed as if they were frozen in time. However, the next 3 decades would change the face of the South forever. Much of that change resulted from the civil rights movement to eliminate Jim Crow laws in the South. Laws that legalized racial discrimination based on the doctrine of separate but equal. This confrontational and sometimes bloody movement started in earnest in June 1946, when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Virginia Law Code, requiring the separation of white and colored passengers in interstate bus transport. 2 years later, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, ordering the end of racial discrimination in the armed forces. Over the next 6 years, blacks and their white supporters chipped away at the barriers of racism, segregation, and discrimination with landmark cases before the Supreme Court, culminating in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which overturned the doctrine of separate but equal, stating separation is inherently unequal. But the tide against discrimination really began to turn in December of 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, starting the Montgomery bus boycott. Brought to the nation through television and radio, the Deep South's treatment of blacks went on display for the whole nation to see. Of course, many Southern whites saw the guaranteeing of civil rights to blacks as just one more governmental intrusion into their personal lives. Many say this turmoil opened the door for a new kind of deep Southern crime. Southern crime that was built on illegal whiskey making, moonshining. Long a tradition in the hills of Appalachia, after World War II, moonshining became more of a business and less the old Scotch-Irish tradition of a little illegal whiskey for friends and neighbors. Steve Beam, a seventh-generation member of the Jim Beam Bourbon Empire, runs a legal micro-distilling operation. He has spoken with a number of the illegal distillers and knows they hold a special place in the heart of many Southerners.
I'll tell you, when we first started distilling, we were visited by a lot of old-timers and old-time moonshiners from the area. And one of the things that I remember most was one of the gentlemen talking about how much work it was. And he said there was no lazy guys around to distill. And it is a tremendous amount of work. And we go through a lot of work here. I can't even imagine what it would be like out in the woods where you're having to pack things in and pack things out. So it's definitely not a lazy person's profession. And you know, there's a lot of knowledge, and it may not be things that people have learned at school, but were handed down or learned on the job. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of knowledge and science that goes into it, even though people may not know that they're using science.
In growing moonshining into a large-scale business, the distillers and haulers of the illegal liquor learned how to manipulate and control the law. A law that, to a large extent, was based on the good old boy concept of justice, a practice that many say was easily translated to more serious organized crime.
I don't know from first-hand experience, but I do know that it goes back again to the that whole notion of God's law and man's law. And I think once you've managed to go on to the other side of the law, it just is easy to, the progression is easy there. And the justification, going back to the same justification that was once with the moonshining and bootlegging, and that is that there's, you know, God's law and then there's man's law, and you know, man's law is not always right, but God's law is the word.
Something else was instrumental in the kind of Southern Mafia that was to blossom after World War II. Something that was a direct result of the war. Southern military bases. The Deep South was home to over 100 military bases, packed with men far from home with little to do. One of those was Fort Benning in Georgia. Fort Benning was founded as Camp Benning in 1918 to help train troops for World War I, and was officially named Fort Benning in 1922. It has served as the home of the Army infantry ever since. The camp encompassed almost 200,000 acres with nearly 100,000 officers and enlisted men. Hewitt Clark has written 3 books on the Southern brand of organized crime. He believes that it all started with a small Alabama town, Phoenix City, a small town just across the border from Fort Benning. It was the beginning of what the media calls the Dixie Mafia.
First of all, there is not anything called the Dixie Mafia. I mean, newspapers call them the Dixie Mafia. They don't call themselves the Dixie Mafia. And this is something the newspaper man in Biloxi, Mississippi came up with, which is it's a good term. It's good as anything to describe these very dangerous Southerners. They talk slow, but they are dangerous. I would say you're going back into the earliest I know about them is back in Phoenix City, Alabama, during the Korean War, back in the 50s, when right across the river from Phoenix City was Columbus, Georgia, which was a huge Army camp. Phoenix, Alabama was one of the wildest places. It may have been the wildest place. I think it was the wildest place in the United States. They had bars, they had all these gambling houses, they had bordellos, they had everything lined up right down the street, right over the bridge. And the soldiers just flocked over there.
The centerpiece of every Dixie Mafia operation was always bootleg whiskey. Dubbed America's wickedest city, Phoenix City was no exception. In addition to illegal booze, it offered every conceivable vice: gambling, prostitution, and drugs. Because of its preying on the soldiers from Fort Benning, General George S. Patton threatened to flatten it with his tanks. The criminal interests in Phoenix City were a law unto themselves. Nowhere else in America did they have such a ruthless grip on the local judicial, political, and law enforcement hierarchy, largely because the law was owned by the criminals. For several decades, Southern good old boys, mobsters, and thugs from all parts of the South actually ran the town and trampled the citizens. But their favorite prey, the soldiers from Fort Benning, the world's toughest fighting men, were the easiest targets in Phoenix City's bars and brothels. Lured by bright lights and big come-ons, many soldiers dropped entire paychecks on a single night. Most were simply fleeced by hookers and crooked dice, while others were slipped knockout drugs and robbed. They were sent home battered as well as broke. And even a few wound up dead in the Chattahoochee River. Now, this was no secret outside of town. Newspapers across the river kept up a steady drumbeat of exposure. But though the place was notorious, the folks of Alabama's state capital in Montgomery looked the other way. And federal agencies were only concerned with big city mafia in northern cities like New York and Chicago. At the same time, when jobs were scarce, the Southern Mob was the largest employer in Phoenix City. Their license fees funded schools and public services and kept taxes low. And it was only a matter of time before the growing criminal syndicate controlled juries and ballot boxes through payoffs, intimidation, and fraud. Eventually, every local official and law enforcement officer owed his job to what became known as the Phoenix City Machine. At the time, Fort Benning officials estimated that 80% of their 80,000 personnel dropped more than half of their pay in the town. That helped push the combined take of all the rackets to about $100 million a year, the rough equivalent of $1 billion today. Eventually, Phoenix City's corruption became too much for some of its citizens. But taking on Phoenix City's Southern Mafia was not easy. As one man said, if you didn't like what the machine was doing, they would pressure you. They would threaten you. And if that didn't work, they would kill you. But the threats and violence didn't stop a small group of citizens from forming, in 1951, the Russell Betterment Association, whose goal was to bring honest government back to Phoenix City. And eventually, a citizens' association was formed to root out the evil. However, such activities triggered harsh reactions from the mob. The home of Hugh Bentley, one of the association's members, was bombed in 1952 while his family slept. Miraculously, no one was hurt. Later that year, Bentley and several of his friends were beaten at a bowling alley, and another member's house was set on fire. Then, in 1954, another Citizen Committee member, Albert Patterson, turned his law practice over to his son and ran for state attorney general. Despite mob-supported opposition, Patterson prevailed on election night by 874 votes. The results, however, wouldn't become official until the state Democratic Party validated the totals in Montgomery on June 10th, 8 days later. Albert Patterson, after working late at his Phoenix City office, was gunned down next to his car. He was struck 3 times, in his chest, the arm, and in the mouth, the death mark for informers. News of the assassination quickly swept across Alabama. Governor Gordon Persons said the killing was akin to throwing a lit match onto a powder keg, and immediately ordered Major General Walter J. Crack Hanna and the Alabama National Guard to Phoenix City to prevent further bloodshed. The commander said that the mission before them was as serious as combat and was the moral equivalent of war. But he emphatically added that he wanted it accomplished without so much as the firing of one shot. Within hours, Hanna's forces launched a series of around-the-clock raids on every joint in town. They broke down doors when owners refused to cooperate and collected truckloads of gambling, bootlegging, and drug paraphernalia. Much of it was found in secret rooms. They also apprehended dozens of people and began closing gambling houses and brothels. Of course, the kingpins of the horrendous murder all escaped justice, including the state attorney general. In the end, America's wickedest city was gone, but not forgotten. Like its mythical namesake, the shadows of Phoenix City would rise from the ashes in other parts of the South. It would become the model for the so-called Dixie Mafia, building pockets of vice around gambling, prostitution, bootleg whiskey, drugs, and murder, setting up organized crime operations located along state lines and often near military bases. Indeed, the Phoenix City mobsters simply spread out in other parts of the Deep South. One of those places was along the Mississippi-Tennessee border. Ironically, when the 2 counties on each side of the border voted themselves dry, it set up the perfect opportunity for bootleg whiskey to once again become the centerpiece of a growing organized crime operation. Located along Highway 45, where it crosses from Mississippi to Tennessee, over half a dozen restaurants, brothels, and motels were taken over by what has been called the State Line Mob. A branch of the Southern Mob, they were a group of the baddest Southern good old boys and women ever assembled. Not only did they come from Phoenix City, but from crime-riddled towns all around the Deep South. By 1956, they were in firm control of the area. And as in Phoenix City, it didn't take long for the State Line Mob to be in control of local law enforcement and politicians. Interestingly, the Southern Mob was never family-oriented like its big city and bootlegging cousins. David Hudson is a Tennessee crime-fighting law historian.
Yeah, I mean, the State Line Mob is interesting. There are different strands of it, so it's hard to pinpoint, but some of these characters are fairly notorious. Louise Hathcock, Carl Towhead White. I mean, these were people that killed people, they ordered hits, they were willing to go to virtually any extreme to protect their pecuniary interests and their criminal empires. And they were not above taking it to extreme levels of violence. You know, the moonshining is almost, it's been accepted somewhat in the sense that there was sort of an underlying benevolence to some of it. They weren't actually out harming people per se. The state line mob was different. It was a more seedier, sort of a nastier criminal element.
There are some fundamental differences between the big city mob and its southern counterpart.
Some of the European big city-based, they, at least originally, they had codes of ethics, so to speak, and I think the codes of ethics sort of dissipated a bit in the Southern mob. I don't think they also didn't have the same rigid sort of familial structure. In other words, in a sense, they were freer. They were more open to outsiders coming in, as long as they proved themselves through acts of violence. So it was a different sort of a different structure.
However, as the 60s dawned, the Southern Mafia was about to meet its match. From 1964 to 1970, a Tennessee sheriff, Buford Pusser, initiated a virtual one-man war on moonshining. Prostitution, gambling, murder, and other vices run by the Mississippi-Tennessee state line mob.
Buford Pusser is just a larger-than-life figure, both literally and figuratively. I think in his prime he stood 6'6", weighed 250 pounds. And I think he stands for the guy who fights for the underdog, the guy who stands for what is right, willing to stand up to evil no matter what the odds. And I think his story resonated in part because of how many times, the sheer number of times he was stabbed and shot. And then, of course, when the movie came out, I think the original Walking Tall movie came out in 1973, where Joe Don Baker played him. And then when that movie came out, that's what made him an American icon.
So who was Buford Pusser? No one knows better than his daughter, Dwana.
My dad was just a regular boy, but he was a mama's boy. And then they moved to Adamsville. Funny thing, my grandmother, very strong woman, and that's where my daddy, I believe, got his the strongness about him, and the height and so forth. Maybe it came more from the Harris side of the family, her family, than the Pusser side of the family. She told my granddaddy they were going to move to Adamsville, which was about 15 miles away. He was a standout in school, in sports, basketball and in football, and like I said, he was a mama's boy, but by no means was he wasn't a bully, but he could not stand for somebody to abuse the elderly or children. He could not stand that. But he'd stand up for himself when he needed to, no doubt about it. He was a prankster. His friends at school tell all about pranks he pulled.
After high school, Pusser joined the Marines. Unfortunately, from his point of view, he was unable to serve because of his chronic asthma. For a time, he was depressed and looking for a new meaning in life.
Before he found himself, before he became the youngest sheriff in Tennessee at age 26, Buford Pusser was in the Marines for 3 months. He thought about going to mortuary school. When he was in Chicago, where he met his wife, where I believe his daughter was born, he actually had a side gig as a professional wrestler. And at 6'6", 250 pounds, he wrestled some of the great wrestlers. He was known by the name of Buford the Bull. And so he used his former high school football and basketball skills and athletic skills. So I think that he did a lot of things in his life. He was kind of adventuresome. To me, I think the seminal event that occurred with him in terms of his law enforcement was when he was in high school and he went down near the state line and went into a gambling facility and started rolling dice. Noticed that the people started cheating him when he got up, and then he called them out on it. and apparently some individuals took him out and beat him nearly to death. I think he had like 192 stitches. And that event, I think, transformed him and made him think about what was right and what was wrong and how there really was evil in the world, very close to his hometown.
It was during his Chicago years that Pusser met his wife, Pauline. On December 5, 1959, Buford and Pauline were married. They had 3 children. So a young Buford Pusser was well prepared for the life-changing call he was about to receive.
And then his dad, who was the police chief of Adamsville, basically begged him to come back down and succeed his father. And I believe he was only age 23 or 24 when he was police chief of Adamsville. And then he became the sheriff of McNairy County at age 26. Still, I think, the youngest person to ever serve as sheriff in the state of Tennessee.
In 1965, the big element was whiskey stills, illegal whiskey stills, and he cleaned up, I think it was 87 whiskey stills, but he had been able to bring in enough revenue that the county let him hire a gentleman to be his deputy. So he had a lot to do, and his thing was, I will answer all calls, and he would himself.
Eventually, Sheriff Pusser turned his attention to the state line mob itself.
Nobody was going to bother him, you know, because everybody was scared of the folks at the state line. Killed people. I've had people tell me stories that are elderly people about in their yard waking up in the morning, be people in the ditch or out this and that that'd been stabbed or shot or whatever, and it all came to the state line, and you didn't complain a whole lot, and you sure didn't raise a bunch of heck over it, or you'd be the next one dead, and nobody was doing anything about it. You know, my daddy was shot and stabbed all those different times from going up against that criminal element. And some people say, well, how brave he was. I think he was brave. Another part of it was that he was just hard-headed too. And like my grandmother, just bound and determined to not let them win.
The leaders of the state line mob were some of the most notorious criminals in the country. Interestingly, the nastiest of the bad guys was a woman.
Well, I think Louise Hathcock is a fascinating individual. First of all, she was a female, so it's a little unusual to have a female that high up in the criminal element. And she claimed that she shot her husband Jack in self-defense. And was successful in that defense. But the reality is that many people believe she may have actually just killed him, gotten him out of the way so she could sort of rise to the top and carry on her liaison with Towhead White. And she really was sort of a legendary figure in a negative sense. She ran the saloon bar down there. And was really one of, I guess you would call her queen pin in today's context.
Hathcock's new partner in crime was Towhead White.
Carl Towhead White was sort of the reputed leader of the state line mob. He was Louise Hathcock's, if you believe some accounts, was her lover. He was the individual who committed various random acts of violence. He sometimes referred to himself as the Al Capone of the South. He thought he was the #1 bad guy, and he often acted like it.
On February 1st, 1966, Sheriff Buford Pusser finally had what he needed. 2 warrants for Louise Hathcock in his pocket, one for theft and one for illegal possession of whiskey. Pusser, accompanied by his deputies, Jim Moffett and Petey Plunk, headed for the state line's dens of iniquity. When they arrived at the infamous Shamrock Motel, they were greeted by Hathcock. Deputy Plunk describes what happened next.
She said, "Sheriff, I want to speak to you a minute." So Buford proceeded to follow her out of the office into #1 cabin, which was her living quarters. And as he got inside of the door of the #1 cabin, she had on a sweater with pockets in it. And she had this little snub-nosed 38 in there. And she come out with that 38 and said, I'm gonna kill you. And she wheeled with the gun, Buford seen her, and he fell across the bed, just as she fired. And then from the looks of it, she had fired at the big part of him, which was his chest. And as he went down, put his head where his chest would normally been, and I'd say she missed his head approximately 4 inches. But as he went down and she fired, he come out with his .41 Magnum. He fired. The first shot, he hit her on the left side of the neck and cut a trench across her neck and shoulder. And it spun her around. And as she spun around, she still had the gun in firing position to fire again. The next shot hit her in the right breast and come out of her back. And you can stick a doorknob in her back where the bullet come out. She hit the floor, hit a chair, turned the chair over, hit the floor on her back, and she raised the gun up again. The next shot, he caught her in the left jaw, underneath her jawbone, and come out the back of her head.
That was not the end of the matter. Towhead White swore revenge and called upon his friend Kirksey Nix to handle the bloody details. While in jail, Towhead ordered the hit. It went down on August 12, 1967. Dwana tells what happened.
That morning, we were going to be leaving to go to Virginia, to my mother's, mother and dad's. It was our vacation. So Daddy was having to wrap things up across the county before he left and take care of everything. We were packed at home and all in the bed, and Daddy got home, and there'd been someone kept calling the courthouse, the jail, as we call it, talking to my grandfather, trying to get through to talk to my daddy. And Granddaddy just felt uncomfortable about the call. Got home, Daddy did, and we're gonna get a couple hours sleep before we left. The call came to the house then, and the guy says, you know, Sheriff, you need to meet me down here. I want to talk to you about state line. I want to give you this evidence. And Daddy said, can it wait? You know, we're leaving and da-da. He said, no, because I'll either be dead or I'll be out of town. He said, I'm leaving. And if you want this evidence, and I can give you exactly what you've been wanting, you're going to have to meet me down here on New Hope Road. So Mother was awake. She said, you know, let me ride with you. Never dreaming what was going to take place. Daddy never had an idea something like that would happen. And as they were driving down through there and pulled out from New Hope Church there, this car did. And it was just becoming, you know, dawn, the sun was beginning to come up. And it pulled up behind him, and all of a sudden here they come with machine guns and just rattled. First time when it come out on him, she was hit in the head. And the car was rattled, bullets. Somehow or another he wasn't hit that time. And they went around and somehow or another, and he thought he'd got away from them to where he'd gotten to. And then pulled off and was trying to raise her up as she went over in his lap and was trying to give her aid. And then they come back on him. And that's when his jaw was blown completely off, his mouth. And the second time she was hit again. And he was able to get on the radio. And my granddaddy was a jailer. He could tell that it was Daddy's voice, but he couldn't really understand. He knew that something was bad wrong, and he just called Corinth and city, and the police officers out there, get to the state line. I don't know where, at the state line, which road, get to the state line, Buford's in trouble. Had no idea Mother was with him. Had no idea. And so, anyway, there was the police chief there at Selmer, went to the jail, Selmer, and picked up my granddaddy Carl, and they went down there. His name, police chief, was Hugh Kirkpatrick, and he'd been in World War I and II. He said he'd never seen anything as bad as he had that morning, and said they couldn't get Daddy to let go of Mother. And they said, and Daddy had not even lost consciousness, and they said, and all this was gone, and said, Buford, you've got to let go. We've got to get you somewhere. Said, you've got the kids, you've got to stay alive for. Said, you've got to. And said they like to never got him pried away from Mother. And never lost consciousness all the way.
Although his beloved wife was killed, remarkably, Pusser survived. After many surgeries and rehabilitation, he was back on the job within a year. Eventually, Buford remarried and became an American icon and celebrity. With his Wild West lawman days over, Pusser was immortalized in the 1973 biopic Walking Tall. Soon after the movie, he was about to make a run to become the Tennessee Attorney General, to become the most powerful lawman in the state. Then, on August 21st, 1974, tragedy struck again right here at this place outside of his hometown of Adamsville, Tennessee.
You could tell there was a car and something had happened. And she said, oh my God, is that Buford? Has he had a wreck? And I said, Miss Shirley, don't say that, don't say that. So we went down the hill, back up, and sure enough, there was Daddy's car and he hit the embankment. There was 2 transfer trucks that had pulled over. I get out and I go run into him, and he's laying down, he's laying face down behind the Corvette. The very front of the Corvette, very, very odd, of all the places, there was a fire that had started right there. Daddy was mumbling, and of course I was screaming, Daddy, 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 Daddy. And I turned him over and was holding his neck, and I was saying, Daddy, Daddy. Daddy don't die, Daddy don't die. And whether he said it or whether he knew it, maybe I just want to believe it, but I believe he was trying to say, Dwana, Dwana. So he died in my arms.
At the young age of 36, Buford Pusser was dead. Dwana believes it was no accident, that his old enemies were not going to let him become Tennessee's #1 lawman. Today, Buford's Adamsville house has been turned into a museum. A museum where Buford's life is frozen in time. The tour starts when you enter the living room of Buford's mother, Helen, left in the same condition as when she passed away in 1987. The next stop is the Pusser kitchen. The smell of fried eggs and bacon still linger from happier times. The upstairs bedrooms are sorrowfully haunting. The first one on the left is Dwana's old bedroom, complete with her childhood toys. Next is Pauline and Buford's bedroom. Still as it was decades ago. The tour continues downstairs, where a room displays more memorabilia of this heroic man's life. To the right is Buford's bedroom after Pauline died, where at any moment you expect Buford to put on his shoes, take a shave, and march off to work. The garage is one of a kind, complete with Buford's wrecked 1974 Chevy Corvette. The car he drove on that last fateful day of his life. A fitting way to end your stay at the Buford Pusser Home and Museum. Finally, we traveled down Old State Highway 45 to the Mississippi-Tennessee border to see what was left of the State Line Mob hangouts, to see if the old Shamrock Motel, where Hathcock met her fate, still survived, and if there was any sign of the El Rey Motel, where Towhead White was riddled with bullets in 1969. Some people think Buford Pusser had Towhead killed that night to even the score for his wife's murder. What we found was creepy and bizarre. As we approach, it is clear that little was left of the State Line Mob's dens of vice and crime. It was like someone wanted to wipe the memory of those days from history. No trespassing signs abound. Random motel signs are strewn about the roadside. Turning back north, suddenly we spot it, the foundation of the Shamrock Motel, where Pusser killed Louise Hathcock. Some of the old floor still remains. Heading north on the right, we spy an old State Line gas station. Just past that, we find one of the only intact remnants left. The old White Iris Club. No doubt a den of drugs, gambling, and whoring. Ignoring the warning signs, we peek inside, where the charred interior of this once nefarious lounge echo of sins long past. It's as close to hillbilly noir as you will find in the Deep South. The ghosts of Buford Pusser, Louise Hathcock, and Towhead White still linger here. Only Kirksey Nix, a bloodthirsty sociopath, escaped retribution. He retreated to another stronghold of the Southern Mob, Biloxi, Mississippi. In this small oceanfront town, he was involved in one of the most blood-chilling murders the Dixie Mafia ever committed. The Strip in Biloxi was home base for the Dixie Mafia. Here they once again preyed on young military men from Keesler Air Force Base. Mike Gillich was the Mafia's unofficial but universally acknowledged kingpin. Of Croatian descent, he had raised himself up from poverty to become one of Biloxi's wealthiest and most powerful men, all from organized crime. He owned a string of motels, sleazy nightclubs that doubled as strip joints, and gambling dens. He was known and trusted by every member of the Dixie Mafia, especially those who trusted no one else. In the words of one federal investigator, Mr. Mike runs the criminals' post office. He's their banker. And he was Kirksey Nix's patron and protector. Hewitt Clark describes the Dixie Mafia's most notorious killer, Kirksey Nix.
His daddy was a federal court judge, and he somehow he got away from them and wound up down in Biloxi. He learned his trade down in Biloxi as a young man, probably 18 years old. He went down there and learned from all these guys. His family is outstanding, Oklahoma, and he was the one running. Nix was the one running all those homosexual things over there in the penitentiary. He's smart, good looking, had everything going for him. I mean, he could have done anything with his life. He was just one of those guys that had to have this excitement. Some people that way, they've just got it. Something about their brain is they have to have this danger, constant danger. You know, some of them climb mountains on ropes and some of them rob banks or whatever, but he was one of those guys.
Born in 1943, at the age of 24, Nix went on a killing spree over the next 4 years that purportedly left 25 people dead in 6 states. Then, in 1972, Nix was convicted of murdering Frank Corso, a New Orleans grocery executive, in a break-in at Corso's home, and began serving a life sentence without parole. But going to jail did not put an end to his Dixie Mafia crimes. Monday, September 14, 1987, began as a normal day in the lives of Vincent and Margaret Sherry of Biloxi, Mississippi. They were a prominent couple, he a judge, she a former city council person and candidate for mayor. Sometime that night, Vince Sherry got up to answer the door, and moments later was shot dead from a silenced .22 caliber Ruger automatic. Margaret, in the bedroom, clad only in her underwear, rushed out, and she too was cut down and left dying on the floor. The stranger who fired the fatal shots disappeared into the night. The 10-year local and federal investigation into the gruesome murders shocked Biloxi and revealed to the world the evil of the so-called Dixie Mafia. The mystery was who committed the murders and why. As far as anyone knew, Vincent Jerome Sherry Jr. and Margaret Smith were the perfect couple. They had been college sweethearts at Bowling Green State University in Kentucky in the late 1940s. They married in 1950. Margaret was the unrelenting, uncompromising foe of corruption and vice. Vince, however, along with his law partner, Peter Pete Hallett, became wealthy by serving the shadowy underworld loosely referred to as the Dixie Mafia. On the night of Monday, September 14, 1987, the question was, who was the primary target, Vincent or Margaret? As many leads came and went, the answer lay in Louisiana's notorious Angola prison, where Kirksey Nix was serving his life sentence.
They had all this stuff going on out of the penitentiary over in Louisiana State Penitentiary. They were running these scams on gays, homosexuals, and running it in the prison, and getting these guys to send somebody money. They sent a young man some money, and they made hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they deposited it all in that law firm in Biloxi, Mississippi. And the head guy there in that firm, this guy named Hallett, stole he stole maybe a couple $100,000. And so he blamed it on his partner, Sherry. And somebody's gonna get killed, no question about it. And so they came in with, Nix hired some hitmen, come in and kill the Sherrys.
At the time of the discovery, Pete Hallett, now the mayor of Biloxi, had actually stolen the money funneled to his law firm from the homosexual Lonely Hearts Club scam and blamed it on his law partner, Vincent Sherry. Sherry's supposed thievery so enraged Kirksey Nix that he ordered the hit on Vincent. When the sordid drama behind the murders was revealed, Mike Gillich and Pete Hallett joined Kirksey Nix in jail. The old Biloxi Strip was torn down and replaced by shiny new casinos. Now, many will say the Dixie Mafia's days are past history. Others know if you want somebody killed and that you know the right people, it's as easy as buying a bottle of moonshine. Ironically, the year the Sherrys were shot dead, a new kind of Southern Mafia was taking shape in the Appalachian hills of Marion County, Kentucky. The same hills where it all began 250 years ago with the distilling of whiskey by the tightly knit family clans of Scotch-Irish immigrants. The same hills that saw the manufacture of illegal moonshine by bootleggers. And, in the 21st century, the hills that are the present-day capital of Kentucky bourbon. What happened in the fateful year of 1987 is that a charming man known as Johnny Boone set out to create the largest marijuana syndicate in the United States. A syndicate that would be dubbed the Cornbread Mafia.
The scale of the operation was unbelievably large. When they raided Johnny Boone, of course, he's been arrested several times. He actually served, 15 years in federal prison. But when they raided him one time, I believe he had 240 tons of marijuana, an astronomical street value. This was an operation that was truly international. He had contacts as far away as Russia. It was just a mammoth marijuana organization, and Johnny Boone was at the top of that pile.
Who is Johnny Boone?
Johnny Boone is sort of an apocryphal figure, legendary figure in Kentucky. There are even T-shirts that you can still buy that say "Run, Johnny, Run, Johnny Boone for President." It sort of looks like Santa Claus, but has that element to him that you know that there's a serious side. But Johnny Boone is sort of the, he's known as the king of pot and the godfather of grass. He's a figure who had sort of a Robin Hood element to him as well. When there were people that were down on their luck, Johnny Boone would give them money. You can still see a lot of people, talk to people who will compliment Johnny Boone and won't have anything bad to say about him. I think part of his legend comes from when the law enforcement raided him in 2008. He took off, and they've never found him.
So the more things change in the Deep South, the more they stay the same. Nowhere is this more true than with the Southern brand of organized crime. With its disdain of the government, tight-knit family clans, and its admiration and worship of the anti-hero, moonshining, bootlegging, pot-growing outlaws.
Johnny Boone himself had the words "Omerta," code of silence, tattooed on his back. I mean, they're not going to catch Johnny Boone. The people that know where he is are not going to give him up.